Morning, everyone. So welcome to our panel today on Deconstructing Myths, Antisemitism, Are Jews White? And we have some distinguished guests that I would like to introduce in a moment. I'm Dr. Eileen Serlin. I'm a fellow of Division 56, the one sponsoring this. Thank you, Division 56, for sponsoring us in your hospitality suite today. Personally, I grew up in New York. I assumed that many of my friends who were Jewish looked like me. And as I began to learn more, I discovered we are Ashkenazic Jews, we are from Europe. And then I met my friend Gina Waldman here on this panel, who opened my eyes to the wide diversity of Jews and really helps us examine our assumptions that Jews are white and therefore privileged, or all the other assumptions that may come from this. So in this panel today, Gina will share with us her story, and Dr. Asaf Romarovsky, who is a scholar from the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, the executive director, will give us a historical perspective on Jews in the Middle East, so we can learn from this. I'm going to share my screen here. And so welcome to our panel today, Antisemitism, Deconstructing the Myth of Jews as White. Gina Waldman will talk about her escape from Libya as a Jew. Dr. Asaf Romarovsky will provide a scholarly history of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. Our abstract for this panel was, number one, about the growing threat of anti-Semitism here and around the world. We have, and other panels are going to be talking about the numbers of attacks from the Anti-Defamation League. We want to embed this in APA's Code of Ethics and its new guidelines that we want to understand all forms of bias and racism as being part of our professional responsibility. So therefore, this panel will address, and we want to have dialogue about some of these myths about who the other are. And this just number one myth here is that Jews are white, and therefore privileged, oppressors, etc. And so our panel are going to include questions. Are all Jews white? Who is indigenous to the Middle East? So now I want to welcome my panelists. And we will start with Gina Waldman. Thank you, please.
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on the history of my own personal story, which is basically the story of nearly 1 million Jews that were expelled, such as myself, from all over the Middle East, from Lebanon to Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and every single Arab countries. I grew up in a community that was pretty much marginalized and always afraid to show that we were Jewish. All of our religious ceremonies, whether it was Passover or Bar Mitzvah, was also very often done in secret. At the age of 6, when my mother took me to a local madrasa school, which is the local public school, we came to see the school in the neighborhood. And the teacher was teaching 6-year-old little girls arithmetic on grade 1. And she came to the board and she wrote, if you have 10 Jews, you kill 5 of them. How many Jews do you have left to kill? I was very traumatized at the time by this experience. And I came home crying to my mother and asking her if we're going to be killed. That was my first very traumatic experience. Later on, of course, I was enrolled in a Catholic school because I had no other choice. And so it was very interesting that I grew up in a Catholic school and went home to an Orthodox kosher home. So I can recite you, prayers in Latin and all kinds of stuff. I also experienced anti-Semitism in the Catholic school as well. Eventually at the age of 14, I was sent to a boarding school in Switzerland, where again, I experienced anti-Semitism by French students. When I got, at the age of 19, I went back for summer vacation, and I was going to go back to my university in Geneva to become an interpreter when the 6-Day War broke out. I was then 19 years old, it was 1967. I'm now 75. And during that period, I was just working as a summer in a company, English company, as a bilingual translator. And the war broke out, and the driver threatened not to take me home. And he said that, starting swearing at me and saying, "You filthy Jews, you are killing our brothers," and so forth. So I was hidden by my boss, who was a bridge engineer, in his home. And I went into hiding in his garage for nearly months. Meantime, I couldn't go home because my parents' house had been surrounded by mob who, walked around rallying against Jews. They marked every Jewish home with a white X, and then a second group of people would come to those properties marked by X and burn them to the ground. So our home had been marked by an X. And thanks to the help of our neighbor, who was a Muslim neighbor from Egypt, who lived on the second floor, came down and told the mob to go away because there were no more Jews living there. Although my parents were in hiding in their own house, he convinced them that there was nobody there and that there was only Muslim brothers living there. Eventually, we were able to obtain a visa. I won't go into details. It was not really a visa. It was an expulsion treaty. Basically, we were being expelled. We were told by the government officials who came to our home that we had a one-way exit visa, never to come back. The government was to confiscate every single thing we owned. We were only allowed to take one suitcase and the equivalent of $20 per person, leaving everything behind to be confiscated by the government. Why? Because we were Jewish. That was the only reason. So when eventually I was able to come back from hiding to join my family, we boarded, first we boarded the bus. We boarded the, I'm sorry, I get pretty emotional when I talk about this. It's very painful for me. First, we were taken by military with their guns, holding their guns, wearing military uniforms on a truck to a bus, and the bus was to take us to the airport. But my father had negotiated for the truck to take us all the way to the airport with the police escort. But when we, at some point halfway, they decided to dump us in the middle of nowhere. And they said, no, you have to take the bus to go to the airport. So having no choice, we boarded this bus. Halfway through the airport, the bus pulls over on a dirt road. And I see that the driver, we were 7 people on the bus, including my grandparents and my uncle, and my parents, myself, and a brother. So the bus driver and the conductor wanted to make sure that we were who we were supposed to be, which is they looked at our passports and said, oh, you are the Bublin family. Well, that was my middle name. So at that point, they pulled over and they started pulling gasoline under the bus. I ran to get some help. Eventually, we got two of my British help friends from the company to come to rescue us. On their way to the airport, they told us that the bus driver and conductor had every intention to burn the bus with us inside. So basically, they rescued us and they saved our lives. I won't go into more details, but that's how we escaped.
Every time I hear that story, Gina, I get chills also. So thank you for opening to it. And I'm sure it will be news to people listening to know that these kinds of things were happening, not uncommon. So Asaf, can you give us your historical, let me just say, Gina founded an organization called Jemena, which is Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, which is really an amazing organization that educates the rest of us about a history very little known, really, about the Jews of North Africa and the culture, well, which is very different than the culture I grew up with. Asaf has a doctorate in North African
Middle
studies, and will give us a historical perspective on, again, there's a topic most of us don't know about Jews from the Middle East.
Sure.
And a question about who was indigenous, when and where. Give us some starting points.
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And obviously I have a great deal of respect and support for the work that Gina and her group do. And obviously there's a lot to discuss in this context. Let me just put out a few pointers just to kind of contextualize what the difference between what I would consider to be the Jews of Europe versus the Jews of the Middle East or the Maghreb in general, as far as how the attitude was historically from the Middle Ages into the kind of modern day experience that Gina has experienced. So to contextualize it, I mean, what is known as, as far as there has been a developing since the Middle Ages of what is known as the kind of Judeo-Islamic tradition. Judeo-Islam, is a culture developed under Muslim rule. Islam, and what I would consider to be historically the Muslim world, Islam itself connotes an entire civilization. So the way that Jews and Christians, or really within the categorization of non-believers, were treated with a different kind of attitude. I would not say, I would add it more to what is considered to be maybe contempt rather than anything else. The idea was, or the way Islam has interpreted believers and non-believers, is that when it comes to Christians and Jews, they had the opportunity to see God's way, and they were offered to take that path and chose not to. And so the reality, as far as how they were looked at, as far as living within the Muslim world, has to do with the fact that they are still considered to be, according to the Muslim narrative, people of the book, but they didn't take it as far as they should have. So their belief system took them as far. If you look at the history of monotheistic religions, we do see a great deal of similarities, and there is an acknowledgement by the Muslim narrative of who preceded the rise of Islam, and there is to that extent, a reciprocity in the sense of the prophets. That is to say that Jewish prophets are actually seen as Muslim prophets. They are interpreted as such. And so their belief that as people of the book, they deserve some degree of contempt, some degree of acceptance. And so that allowed the rise of Jewish communities in the Muslim world. To Gina's point, Jewish communities developed from the Middle Ages in different capacities and different constellations, depending on how tolerable they were seen to the local administrations and the local governments within the Muslim narrative. And that also impacted how they were treated and tolerated. That being said, there were, of course, limitations on what they could or could not do. Synagogues and churches could not be larger or higher than mosques. Certain positions you could not be responsible for or hold as a result of being a people of the book. They were considered to be basically what is known in the Arabic and the Muslim narrative as dhimmis. Dhimmis are considered to be second-class citizens. They paid what is known as a tax. That tax allowed them to create this level or maintain that level of tolerance. And there were differences, I would say, between Jews of Arabia, that is to say, and versus Jews of North Africa. In the North African region, there was much more, a little bit depending, some tolerance existed a little bit more as far as some countries, though persecution played out, along the way. I wholeheartedly agree, with Gina's family experience, which is no different than many other Jews of the Arab world, that when it came to contemporary times, were forcibly removed to leave their country with the intent of no coming back and pushed out as a result of that. If you survey the kind of larger look at some of these communities today, that don't exist, for example, you can look at the Jews of Lebanon, the Jews of Syria, who those communities are basically non-existent today when it comes to the Arab Muslim world. That being said, if you look at the remnants of Jewish communities, for example, in Tunisia, you can look at examples of the island of Jerba, where there is still a vibrant Jewish community that still exists to this very day. Libyan Jews, where Gina is from, it's again not really, there's no longer really a community there. Similar to Algeria, you still saw up until the 70s and 80s communities and Jews in Iraq. When it comes to the Iraqi perspective, Iranian Jews still exist these days. Again, there's also there is a community that exists there. That being said, we can talk. There's a much larger treatment that needs to be discussed about how the Jewish community is treated by the Shah, by the larger environment, and by the mullahs, today, and how they were treated under the Shah itself. Jews were able to escape Iran. The Jewish community that still exists today there is still a core community that's still there. You can as you go further survey around the Arab Muslim world, there are still remnants of Jewish community as synagogues that existed in Egypt. Obviously, we can talk about the fact, historically speaking, about the role of the Jewish scholar Maimonides, as far as his role with Islam and his ability to rise in the ranks and be respected not only as a scholar but also as a medical physician. These are the kind of examples that create the historical narrative of the Jews of the Muslim world. But I would say that overall, there is, and this is something that related to our conversation, there is a fundamental question in the scholarship of the kind of execution of what is Muslim anti-Semitism versus what is Christian anti-Semitism, and how it materialized in different places. The animosity towards Christian anti-Semitism as a result of Jews being so different within European societies, given their wardrobe, given their vernacular, their dialect, and things of the sort, created this kind of ghettoization in many respects. The secular Jews were also targeted because of the usual anti-Semitic tropes that we have discussed, and in the past, and the things that have played out into the tropes themselves. But those narratives also existed as well, in a Muslim constellation in a different regard. as far as being different, as far as not being, is not believing enough in the cause. Though, given the similarities societal-wise, as far as Jewish civilizations within the Muslim societies, their similarities allowed for a little bit more tolerance and sympathies. And so the kind of pogroms that we saw in Europe were not as visible, though obviously if you're looking for extreme cases, you can go to Iraq and see the kind of environment that took place during the Farhud when Jews were massacred and attacked. So again, there are variations of treatment as far as how things were looked at. Under the Ottoman Empire, again, especially during the Ottoman Empire, when it became to what was then Jews who were living under the Ottoman Empire, and when the Ottomans were controlling parts of then pre-1948, as far as the areas of Jerusalem and Jewish places, there was much more of a similarity between the Sephardic and North African Jews and the Ottoman Jews to the kind of European Jews. That made them stand out differently and allowed for a little bit more tolerance. Again, it's not acceptance, it's more of a sense of contempt and tolerance within that narrative. That being said, if you fast forward to modern day times, by the time you get to the 30s and 40s, and you look at the state of Israel coming to fruition in 1948, there has been throughout the 50s and 60s a clear eradication of the Arab communities from its Jews. And Gina's story is no different than many other Jews who were forced to leave with a certificate, one suitcase, a limitation, the amount. And by the way, the suitcase and money they received was done in order for them not to ask for reparations and compensation, as if to show symbolically that they received something and they left legally on their own volition without, intent of coming back. But there is a double exodus that takes place between the wars, where I would say that more Jews, factually speaking, more Jews, 100%, were forcibly removed than so-called Arab Palestinians during the War of 48. And the numbers, are close to 1 million Jews that were forced out of the Arab world at large because they were Jewish, not because of anything else, but because of their Jewishness. And so while the anti-Semitism could be different, the hatred is still there. If you look at contemporary illustrations of how Jews are depicted as sons of pigs and monkeys and things of the sort, these are the kind of issues that are played out in contrast to the kind of Christians, typical anti-Semitism of Jews depicted as Christ killers, God killers, and whatnot, where you have a different kind of evolution of the anti-Semitism that exists there. But make no mistake, these have affected all our communities worldwide. But again, I think that the Islam and the Islamic lands, which connotes Islamic civilization, and that narrative has played into Islamic law, Islamic culture, and how Jews played into that. It was a question of more contempt and in some places more tolerance than anything else. But these communities were allowed to develop because of that. And in some places, historically speaking, they were able to survive and succeed more than other places based on how the amount of tolerance existed. So let me end there. And of course, Eileen, you can take it to any questions you have.
Wonderful. And I'm so glad you took it to the present.
Thank you.
I would like to ask now, all those maybe this, Asaf used the word trope. There's one about, I just want to ask if you would both speak to this question of origins, because one of the issues that comes up about indigenous, are Jews indigenous to the Middle East, Israel? Who was there first? If you could talk about Babylonia and when the first historical evidence of Jews in the Middle East, how far back Jews go. And then the other myth then is oppressors, because Jews are often portrayed as the oppressors, not the victims. And a lot of the narratives today are who are the victims? And Jews are often seen as the oppressors and not as having been victimized. So the origin story about who was there first was more indigenous. Speak to when Jews first appeared in the Middle East. We have 10 minutes, so let's see if we can do this. And so the other is about victim versus oppressor. What are the implications for what we just heard?
I'll let Gina talk about the historical part, and then I'll go into the victim-victimizer mentality.
Well, we can trace our roots since Nabucodonosor in the 585 BCE. You're the historian, you can correct me. But then when Jews were expelled, they pretty much settled in different Arab countries always in the Middle East. And so we originated from the Middle East. We were not colonizers. We were not from Europe. We didn't come to colonize Israel. We were already there. We were already from the Middle East. We spoke Arabic and we didn't speak Yiddish. So very often, it is actually interesting to know that we are the biggest, if you want to call it, ethnic group within the Jewish community itself. And we are in Israel today, the majority. We are over 52%. And so to say that we were oppressing people when we ourselves suffered trauma and expulsion from our own homeland that had been our homeland for over 2,500 years, some of them like Iraq and Iran over 3,000 years, it's a very grave mistake. And I always say that it really was an exchange of population, like Asaf was saying. We were made refugees because the Arab countries declared a war against the new country of Israel. And as a result, there were two kinds of wars. One was directed against the Jews of all of the Middle Eastern and North African countries by expelling us. And the other war was, of course, the military war against Israel. So we were not part of any wars. We were not politicians. We did nothing to deserve this kind of fate. And yet, yes, and we were definitely much higher in numbers than the Palestinians. So it was an exchange of population. Like there were many cases in Pakistan or India or many African countries and, and so forth. So.
Very important. Thanks, Gina. Thank you. Asaf, speak to those questions.
No, and I would also add to that last point that Gina raised. I think it's critical to understand the majority of the Arab Palestinians who are so-called refugees. In those who did not flee, and they were told to flee, and let me be clear here, the mandate came from the Arab League of Nations, and basically the message was very clear: leave. Once we eradicate the Zionist entity, you can come back to your homes. And so, and those who stayed, and actually there was overtures, historically speaking, by the Jewish community for the Arabs of the area to stay around, they eventually became the Arab Israelis by process of naturalization. So because, there was a foregone conclusion perceived by the Arab world as far as the existence of Jews and what they perceive to be as Muslim land, which, by the way, also ties into the roots of the war of 1948, Israel's War of Independence, is because they believe that Israel was occupying Muslim land. I mean, there's a theological understanding to how this entirely played out. And by the way, the historical roots that I described before, it's critical to understand, have also played into contemporary Arab and Palestinian leaders' statements. For example, Yasser Arafat used the expansion of the Prophet Muhammad's so-called tolerance toward the Jews of Medina, until he got to Mecca as what he considered to be before, and this was done until he could kill and destroy them. That was how he sold, for example, in the 1990s, the Oslo years. Any agreement signed with the Israelis has to be a temporary agreement that could be broken as a result of killing the greater evil that is embedded within Judaism and within Jews at large. The idea, Jews historically speaking, have been in this area for generations. And it goes back to all the expulsions you can find historically, artifacts, you can find archaeology, you can find documentation. They've always been a presence. Even during the times of diaspora, there was always an expulsion. There's always been Jews in this land, biblical land of Israel. And so until the modern day contemporary aspect. The contemporary element of how Jews are seen as expulsion of individuals and occupying individuals, that is a politicized propagandist narrative that is played into the political narrative that has come out of the Arab world as a result of their inability to eradicate Israel from this land. I mean, that has to be clear about how this entire narrative was shaped. And the colonial kind of settler colonial narrative that today is the most pervasive narrative as a way to describe the conflict is a fallacious narrative. I mean, Jews did not come, even in modern day times with the idea of expelling the other. Actually, they worked together. And then when the war was, this is how the environment played out. And so they were defending themselves. And as I said before, the idea that the Arab Israelis today are the Arabs who stayed. I mean, so this is also clear in the facts you understand between what happened pre-1948 and post-1948. What has played out politically speaking is a narrative of victimizer that was shaped, I would say, mostly when there was a significant amount of power exercised post-1967, where the Arab world felt that here we were attacked by Jews, and so we have to turn the narrative around. And so now, so if you add that compiled with the use of what is so pervasive within the Palestinian narrative and encircled within the Muslim world of what is known as the use of Holocaust inversion, that is to depict Jews as Nazis, and to depict Jews as racist, to depict Jews as victimizers. That is a modern day propaganda narrative that is played in to create this myth of where the Jews are, the David and Goliath metaphor has basically shifted. And that's the politicization of what you're seeing play out today. It is not rooted in any kind of facts or history or anything along those lines. But this propaganda and this story is what has unfortunately been the one that has been the most notable one sold in those who have no understanding and no context of the history of the Middle East or the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Wow.
I would like to add, thanks, Asaf, this was so well put. I want to add a phrase in Arabic. I would like to address the leaders of the Arab world. And my words are haram alaikum, shame on you. Why am I saying that? Because my leadership, my Jewish community refused to let me sit in a refugee camp for all these years. You have allowed your people, innocent people, to sit in refugee camps and keep getting handouts from United Nations, knowing full well that you could have integrated them just like I have been integrated. Just like the Jewish community didn't want me to sit in a refugee camp. Any Jew that went to either Europe, Israel didn't have such an easy time integrating Jews. Of course not. They struggled just like I struggled when I came to this country. But at the end, I was integrated in my own community. But to keep people, innocent people, young people, pumping them with more propaganda against the Jews, it only creates more and more hatred from one generation to the next. You have to stop. And the other message I have is for the people who are in the psychology, whether you are a member of IPA or practice psychology, I beg you to work with people such as myself who have been traumatized, to help them to realize that hatred, anti-Semitism, racism is something that they need to, the psychologists need to understand how deep the trauma is and how they can actually help victims, not by teaching more racism like the Professor Laila Shaheen does in her classes of diversity, where she's actually turning the class into a class of anti-Semitism. I appeal to you to stop that and to learn more about how you can help people that have been traumatized, such as myself.
We do have to stop here. I would like to do two things. First of all, thank both of you. We could go on. And Gina, Asaf, Dr. Romarovsky, there are so many things to say. Asaf, you used the word, I think, fallacious narrative, and that's what I'm calling a myth. I think the first step is just to expose some of these myths that have been taught and perpetuated, on which gets built a lot more hatred, hostility, anti-Semitism, that Jews are white, Jews are oppressors, Jews invaded, et cetera, et cetera. So as we start looking at these, realistically, historically challenging these accepted myths that are being perpetuated, I think the consequences of that will really open our eyes to a much more complex and interesting narrative of what's actually happened. So this is a beginning.
Let me say one thing to your point. I mean, we are demanded as social scientists, as scholars, to actually look at data and research before we come to any conclusions. And I think that it is, we and the university system and as scholars, and so so scholarship is what we're looking to promote, not propaganda. I think that it is disingenuous to push along a narrative that is fully based on propaganda, which is the BDS narrative, without looking at actual fact. And if you're looking at facts, looking at what actually took place, and based on data, you can come to correct conclusions. But if you're basing your entire viewpoint on slogans and propaganda, you're going to come up exactly with this kind of myopic viewpoint that is detached from the reality on the ground.
And finally, to say that's true for us as psychologists. We are scholars. We are scientists. We also have an ethics code that really commands us to be responsible, to be open to all sides and to look critically and not to accept bias uncritically. So we have our own statements passed by the American Psychological Association, and we need to adhere to that as our own ethical responsibility. So I think you've shown us a lot more that we really need to acknowledge and accept and move forward from. So I thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
It's a very important document. Thank you again.
Thank you.